Some instincts don't follow orders, they follow something deeper than survival. The alarm had already been screaming for nearly 40 seconds before anyone fully understood what was happening at the remote training facility outside Quantico, Virginia. Thick gray smoke rolled through the corridors like a living current, swallowing fluorescent lights and turning steel walls into blurred shadows. Staff Sergeant Caleb Morgan moved fast through the chaos, his voice steady but tight as he called out into the comms, his boots striking the floor in a rhythm that matched the collapsing order around him. Beside him was Frost, a white-coated K9 German Shepherd whose presence cut through the haze like a moving signal of focus and instinct. Frost's breath came low and controlled, his eyes locked forward, reading the environment in a way only years of training and trust could explain. Caleb had worked with many K9 partners before, but Frost was different. Not just because of his rare white coat that stood out even in darkness, but because of the silence in his intelligence, the way he seemed to understand intent before command. Today, however, there was no routine, no controlled exercise, only urgency pressing in from every direction as an unexpected fire had spread through one of the facility's lower wings. The evacuation order had been given, but Caleb knew from experience that orders never accounted for everything. As they moved deeper, the structure groaned softly, metal reacting to heat in slow, uneasy protests. Somewhere ahead, visibility dropped to almost nothing, and Caleb raised his arm slightly, signaling Frost to stay close. The dog moved in perfect sync, never more than a step behind, his paws silent against the reinforced flooring. There were moments in training where everything felt predictable, almost mechanical, but this was not one of them. This was the kind of situation where instinct replaced protocol, where every second stretched too long, and every sound carried meaning. Caleb's radio crackled with fragmented updates, but the message was clear enough. Parts of the facility were no longer stable. Still, he pressed forward. Frost suddenly paused, his body shifting from motion to stillness so abruptly that Caleb felt the change instantly. The K9's head tilted slightly, ears tightening, as if he had caught something beneath the noise. A faint sound carried through the corridor, almost lost beneath the structure's strain, something subtle enough that most would have ignored it, but not him. Frost turned his gaze toward a side passage where smoke thickened into a nearly solid wall. Caleb followed his line of sight, hesitation flickering for just a fraction of a second. "Stay focused, Frost," he said firmly, though his voice carried less command than reassurance. But Frost did not move forward or back. Instead, he took a slow step toward the side corridor, his posture changing in a way Caleb had only seen a few times before, the posture of absolute decision. The firelight flickered across his white fur, giving him an almost spectral appearance as he stood between escape and return. Caleb reached for the harness, instinctively trying to redirect him, but something in Frost's behavior stopped him short. It wasn't disobedience. It was recognition. Whatever Frost had sensed was not random. It was specific, urgent, and still alive in some form within the structure. Caleb exhaled slowly, eyes narrowing as he listened harder, and for a moment, beneath the distant structural groan and the ventilation alarms, he thought he heard it too, a faint irregular rhythm that did not belong to machines. Frost took another step toward the smoke-filled passage, his body tense but controlled, as if every instinct of survival was being weighed against something heavier. Caleb felt the shift in the air between them, that silent understanding that sometimes forms in the field without words or explanation. "No," Caleb said again, softer this time, but Frost did not look back. The white K9 stood at the edge of the corridor, smoke curling around him like a tide waiting to be crossed, and in that moment, everything slowed, as if the entire facility held its breath waiting for the choice that was about to be made. Caleb Morgan felt the weight of the moment settle in his chest as Frost stepped closer to the smoke-filled corridor, the white coat of the K9 fading in and out of view as if the fire itself was swallowing the boundary between decision and instinct. For a brief second, Caleb's training told him to pull back, to follow protocol, to retreat with what they already had, but something deeper, something built from years of trust with his partner, held him in place. Frost did not look afraid. His posture was not rushed or panicked. It was deliberate, focused, almost calm in a way that made the chaos around him feel even louder. Caleb adjusted his breathing, stepping forward just enough to stay within reach, his voice steady but lower now, carrying less command and more connection. "Frost, stay close," he said, though he already knew the dog was not acting out of confusion. The corridor ahead was narrowing as heat shimmer distorted the edges of the walls, and faint emergency lighting flickered above them like a fading heartbeat. Somewhere deeper inside, that subtle, irregular sound returned, barely perceptible, but enough to hold Frost's attention like a thread pulling him forward. The K9 moved first, easing into the corridor with a slow, controlled pace, each step measured as if he was mapping the space with senses beyond sight. Caleb followed immediately, keeping one hand near the harness without gripping too tightly, trusting the bond more than the fear pressing in from the environment. The air grew heavier as they advanced, carrying the scent of heated metal and ash, and every few steps the structure would respond with a low groan, reminding them that time inside was limited. Frost suddenly paused again, this time closer to the source of the sound, his head angling toward a partially open maintenance door that hung slightly askew. Caleb stopped behind him, listening harder, and now he heard it too, a faint rhythmic pattern that did not belong to collapsing structure or mechanical systems. It was uneven but present, like something or someone still holding on beneath layers of obstruction. Frost turned his head back toward Caleb for just a moment, not for permission, but for alignment, as if confirming that they understood the same thing without needing language. Caleb nodded once, slow and firm. "I hear it," he said quietly, more to himself than to the dog. Frost stepped forward again, pushing through the partially open door, and Caleb followed into a narrower service passage where visibility dropped further, the walls closer now and the light reduced to dim pulses. The sense of urgency shifted here, becoming less about escape and more about purpose. Frost's movements changed subtly, becoming even more precise, as if he was triangulating direction based on sound, scent, and something less definable. Caleb's mind raced through possibilities, but he kept his focus anchored to Frost, trusting that whatever the K9 had detected was not random chance. The passage opened slightly into a small utility chamber where debris had shifted, creating uneven paths across the floor. Frost moved immediately toward one corner, his attention locked, while Caleb swept his gaze across the space, searching for what the dog already knew was there. The faint sound grew clearer now, still weak but consistent, and Caleb's expression tightened with realization rather than fear. Frost lowered his head, carefully navigating around obstructed areas, and Caleb followed closely, the bond between them now the only stable reference point in a place that felt increasingly unstable. "Easy," Caleb whispered, though it applied as much to himself as to Frost. The K9 stopped near a partially blocked section of the chamber where light from above filtered through a damaged vent, casting a soft glow across the dust-filled air. Frost stood still, focusing intently, then took a single step forward and stopped again, as if confirming location with absolute certainty. Caleb approached slowly, crouching slightly to get a better angle, and as he listened, the faint rhythmic sound resolved into something more distinct, something that carried presence rather than emptiness. Frost did not move further. Instead, he waited, steady and composed, as if the reason they had come into the fire was now directly in front of them, just beyond what could be immediately seen. The moment Frost stood motionless in the dim utility chamber, Caleb Morgan felt the entire world narrow into that single point of focus where instinct replaced instruction and silence carried more weight than any command. The faint rhythmic sound they had been tracking grew slightly clearer now, not louder, but more defined, as if whatever was producing it was conserving energy, holding on rather than calling out. Caleb slowly lowered himself further, bringing his ear closer to the obstructed section Frost was staring at, careful not to disturb the fragile balance of noise and stillness inside the space. Dust floated in the thin beam of light coming through the damaged vent above, drifting like slow snow in a sealed winter sky, and every movement felt amplified in the confined chamber. Frost did not move. His body was still, but every muscle was engaged, locked into precision and awareness. Caleb reached a hand out slowly, not toward Frost, but toward the debris in front of them, carefully shifting a light piece of fallen material just enough to change the angle of what they could see. That was when the sound became unmistakable. It was irregular, weak, but consistent, the kind of rhythm that did not belong to machines or collapsing structures. It was life. Caleb froze for a moment, his breath catching as realization settled in, not as panic, but as clarity. Frost immediately adjusted his position, stepping slightly to the left, his nose lowering toward a narrow gap between collapsed shelving and twisted metal framing. The K9's focus intensified, and for the first time since entering the facility, his calm carried urgency rather than exploration. Caleb's voice dropped to a near whisper, more respect than instruction. "There is someone here," he said, though it was not a question. Frost responded by pressing forward just enough to confirm direction, then stopping again as if waiting for permission that he already knew would come. Caleb carefully began moving small pieces of debris, working methodically, aware that any sudden shift could destabilize the fragile environment. The heat in the chamber was less intense here, but the air felt heavier, filled with dust and the lingering tension of trapped space. Frost suddenly shifted his stance and let out a low, controlled alert sound, not a bark of alarm, but a signal of certainty. That sound changed everything. Caleb increased his pace, carefully clearing more of the obstructed area until a narrow opening began to form between the collapsed structure and the wall behind it. Through that opening, a faint movement could be seen, subtle and uncertain, confirming what Frost had already understood before human senses could fully process it. Caleb leaned closer, his voice calm but urgent. "Hold on," he said softly, as if speaking directly to whoever was trapped beyond the debris. Frost remained steady, positioned beside him like a fixed point in the shifting chaos of the environment, his eyes locked forward, unblinking, unwavering. The bond between Handler and K9 in that moment was not about command or obedience, but shared certainty, a mutual understanding that the reason they were here had now been found. Caleb carefully widened the opening just enough to improve visibility, his movements precise and controlled, while Frost maintained position, acting as both anchor and guide. The faint rhythmic sound continued, slightly stronger now, responding almost imperceptibly to their presence. Caleb exhaled slowly, steadying himself as he prepared to reach deeper into the space, aware that whatever lay beyond was still fragile, still holding on in silence. Frost did not move ahead. He waited, as if the next decision belonged equally to both of them, in a place where instinct and humanity had finally aligned toward the same point of hope. Caleb Morgan held his position in front of the narrow opening, his eyes adjusting to the faint outline of space beyond the collapsed structure, where dust and dim light formed a fragile curtain between certainty and the unknown. Frost stood beside him, completely still now, as if the entire environment had narrowed into the same singular focus they both shared. The faint rhythmic sound they had been following did not disappear, but instead steadied, becoming more consistent as if responding to their presence. Caleb carefully shifted another piece of debris, slow and controlled, each movement deliberate to avoid disturbing the fragile structure around them. As the gap widened slightly, a clearer shape began to emerge in the darkness beyond, indistinct at first, then gradually forming into something that confirmed what Frost had already understood long before Caleb could see it. The air felt heavier here, not from heat alone, but from the stillness of confined space where time itself seemed to slow. Frost leaned forward just slightly, not crossing the threshold, but adjusting his stance in a way that communicated focus rather than urgency. Caleb's voice softened again, steady and reassuring, as if speaking through the narrow opening itself. "We are here," he said quietly, though there was no expectation of response, only presence. The rhythmic sound shifted subtly, reacting to that presence, becoming slightly stronger, slightly more defined, like a fragile signal meeting recognition. Caleb carefully extended his arm further into the space, bracing himself against the surrounding debris while maintaining control over his movement. Frost remained positioned beside him, his white coat reflecting faint fragments of light, his attention never wavering from the same point in the darkness. There was no hesitation in him now, only confirmation, as if the purpose of his return into the structure had been resolved into something real and tangible. Caleb adjusted his position again, widening the opening just enough to improve visibility, and in that brief shift, the outline beyond became clearer, revealing that what lay inside was not static, but alive and responding. The realization settled in quietly, without shock, but with a steady gravity that replaced uncertainty with responsibility. Frost let out a low, controlled breath through his nose, maintaining his position as Caleb carefully worked to stabilize the space around the opening. The environment continued to strain around them, but within this small chamber of focus, everything felt momentarily suspended, as if the fire and chaos outside had receded just enough to allow this single moment to exist. Caleb paused for a fraction of a second, absorbing the significance of what Frost had already known from the beginning, and then he nodded slightly, more to himself than to anyone else. "Stay with me," he said softly, as he prepared to reach further into the space, fully aware now that what they had found had turned their mission into something far more delicate than extraction alone. Frost did not move forward, nor did he retreat. He simply remained, steady and unwavering, as the silent agreement between them held firm in the dim light of the collapsing structure, where instinct had already become certainty. Caleb Morgan maintained his position at the edge of the narrow opening, his breathing controlled but increasingly focused as the faint rhythmic sound continued to stabilize into something unmistakably human in its irregularity. The surrounding debris seemed to press inward with every passing second, as if the structure itself was narrowing its tolerance for time spent inside. But Frost remained completely steady, anchored beside him like a fixed point in a collapsing world. Caleb carefully adjusted his grip, shifting one more section of fractured material just enough to widen the visual corridor, and in that moment the shape beyond became clearer, no longer abstract or uncertain, but defined enough to confirm presence. The realization did not arrive as shock, but as a quiet shift in responsibility, the kind that replaces hesitation with purpose. Frost's posture changed subtly again, not in urgency, but in alignment, as if confirming that what they were seeing matched exactly what he had sensed from the beginning. Caleb lowered his voice further, almost a whisper carried into the confined space. "We are getting you out," he said calmly, though the words felt less like instruction and more like assurance to both sides of the opening. The rhythmic sound responded faintly again, not increasing in volume, but in consistency, as if recognition itself was providing stability. Caleb shifted his position to create a safer angle, carefully bracing himself against the surrounding structure while ensuring that no sudden movement would destabilize what remained intact. Frost remained perfectly still, his white coat catching the faintest traces of flickering light, his attention locked forward with unwavering focus. The environment outside the chamber continued to strain and groan under distant heat and pressure, but within this narrow space, everything felt suspended, as if the world had narrowed down to breath, sound, and intent. Caleb reached forward again, this time more deliberately, carefully clearing enough space to establish a direct line of access, his movements precise and controlled, guided by both training and intuition. Frost adjusted his stance slightly, stepping just half a pace closer, not entering further, but refusing to retreat, maintaining a presence that seemed to anchor Caleb's focus as much as the situation itself. There was a moment of silence where even the faint sound seemed to hesitate, and in that silence Caleb understood fully that they were no longer searching, they were responding. He paused briefly, steadying his breathing, and then spoke again with calm certainty. "You are not alone," he said, the words carrying through the small opening with a reassurance that required no reply. Frost remained still, but alert, his gaze fixed on the same point in the darkness, as if confirming that every second now mattered in a way that extended beyond instinct alone. The space between them and what lay beyond felt thinner now, not physically, but in meaning, as if the boundary between rescue and realization had already begun to dissolve. Caleb Morgan held his position at the edge of the fragile opening, his focus sharpened by the steady return of that faint rhythmic sound that now carried a clearer sense of presence, as if the distance between them and what lay beyond had finally begun to collapse into something reachable. The air inside the chamber felt heavier with each passing second, not because of heat alone, but because of the weight of awareness that had settled over both man and K9. Frost remained unwavering beside him, his white coat dimmed by dust and shifting light, his posture unchanged yet fully engaged, as if he had already committed himself to the outcome long before Caleb had reached understanding. Caleb carefully adjusted his position again, widening the opening just enough to improve stability without compromising the surrounding structure, and as he did, the sound beyond grew fractionally stronger, no longer uncertain but deliberate in its persistence. It was not a call for help in the traditional sense, but something more fragile, something that required proximity rather than command. Caleb paused for a moment, feeling the narrow space between control and urgency tighten, then leaned in slightly to better align his perspective with the opening. "We are still here," he said softly, his voice calm and measured, intended not to disturb but to reassure whatever presence remained beyond the barrier. Frost did not move forward, but his attention deepened, his head angled precisely toward the same point, confirming what Caleb already understood without needing interpretation. The structure around them groaned faintly in the distance, a reminder that time remained limited, yet inside this small chamber, the urgency had transformed into focus. Caleb shifted debris carefully once more, creating a clearer path of visibility, and in that moment the outline beyond became more defined, no longer ambiguous but consistent enough to confirm life maintaining itself through silence and restraint. Frost responded with a subtle change in posture, lowering his center of gravity slightly, as if preparing for coordinated action rather than exploration. Caleb felt the shift immediately and adjusted his stance to match, recognizing that the next movement would require precision rather than force. He reached forward slowly, ensuring each motion was controlled, and stabilized the surrounding material to prevent any sudden collapse of the narrow passage they had created. The rhythmic sound persisted, now steady enough to act as a guide rather than a mystery, and Caleb exhaled slowly, grounding himself in the reality of what Frost had led them to. "Hold on just a little longer," he said quietly, his tone steady and unwavering, carrying through the confined space like a promise rather than a request. Frost remained at his side, perfectly still, his focus unbroken, as the invisible connection between Handler and K9 reached a point of complete alignment, where instinct, trust, and purpose merged into a single forward motion toward what lay just beyond reach. Caleb Morgan remained steady at the edge of the narrow opening, his hands carefully braced against the fractured structure as the faint rhythmic sound beyond continued to hold its fragile consistency, no longer uncertain, but now steady enough to guide every movement he made. The space around them felt increasingly suspended, as if the outside world had been reduced to distant memory, leaving only breath, focus, and the quiet confirmation that something still existed beyond the barrier they were working to overcome. Frost stood beside him without shifting position, his white coat dulled by dust and heat haze, his attention locked forward with a level of precision that left no doubt about his understanding of what lay ahead. Caleb adjusted his stance again, carefully widening the opening by a fraction, ensuring that the structure remained stable while improving visibility into the confined space beyond. The sound they had been following now carried a subtle change, not in volume but in clarity, as if awareness itself had reached across the divide and acknowledged their presence. Caleb leaned closer, his voice low and controlled, speaking with calm assurance into the narrowing space. "We are here with you," he said, the words steady and deliberate, designed not to command but to anchor. Frost responded with a subtle shift in posture, lowering slightly as if preparing for coordinated movement, his body aligned perfectly with Caleb's intent. The air inside the chamber felt denser now, not with danger, but with anticipation, as if every second was holding its breath. Caleb carefully reached forward once more, stabilizing the debris to prevent any shift that could close the fragile opening they had created. Dust drifted slowly through the faint beam of light above, moving like suspended time, and every motion felt amplified by the silence surrounding them. The rhythmic sound persisted, now stronger in definition, confirming presence rather than mystery, and Caleb's focus narrowed further as understanding replaced uncertainty. Frost remained motionless but fully engaged, his gaze fixed on the same point beyond the opening, as if reinforcing the connection that had already been. established without words. Caleb exhaled slowly, grounding himself in the responsibility of the moment, then spoke again with quiet certainty. "We are not leaving," he said softly, the statement carrying through the confined space with unwavering calm. Frost did not move, but the tension in his posture shifted slightly, signaling readiness without urgency, control without hesitation. The environment outside the chamber continued to strain faintly in the distance, but within this narrow space, everything had resolved into focus, alignment, and the silent understanding that what they had found was no longer distant, but within reach of rescue. Caleb Morgan stayed locked in position at the narrow opening, his hands steady against the fractured structure as the faint rhythmic sound beyond continued to stabilize into something unmistakably consistent, carrying a fragile sense of life that now defined every action inside the chamber. The surrounding air felt heavier with awareness rather than heat, as if the space itself had narrowed to the single purpose of connection. Frost remained exactly where he was, his white coat dimmed by dust and shifting light, his posture unchanged but fully engaged, every muscle aligned with focus that required no instruction. Caleb carefully adjusted his position once more, widening the opening by a controlled fraction, ensuring the structure remained stable while improving access to what lay beyond. The sound grew clearer again, not louder, but more coherent, confirming presence in a way that required no interpretation. Caleb leaned forward slightly, his voice calm and steady as it passed into the confined space. "We are still with you," he said, each word deliberate and grounding, meant to hold space rather than fill silence. Frost responded with a subtle shift in stance, lowering just slightly, as if preparing for the next coordinated movement, his attention never leaving the same fixed point beyond the opening. The environment outside the chamber continued to strain faintly in the distance, but within this narrow corridor of focus, everything felt suspended, as if time had slowed to accommodate understanding. Caleb reached forward. Again, carefully stabilizing another section of debris, his movements precise and controlled, aware that even the smallest shift could alter the fragile balance they had created. Dust drifted through the faint light above, moving slowly like suspended fragments of time itself, and every breath felt measured against the weight of what they were about to confirm. Frost remained still, his presence unwavering, acting not as a follower, but as an equal anchor in the unfolding moment. Caleb exhaled slowly, steadying himself as he leaned slightly closer to the opening, and in doing so, the outline beyond became clearer than before, resolving into something that carried undeniable continuity of life. The rhythmic sound persisted, now steady and calm, no longer uncertain but present with quiet resilience. Caleb paused for a brief moment, absorbing the significance without breaking focus, then spoke again with calm assurance. "You are not alone anymore," he said softly, his voice carrying through the confined space with a certainty that replaced hesitation. Frost did not move forward, but his posture shifted subtly, signaling readiness and alignment, as if every second now belonged to the act of careful rescue. The narrow space between them and what lay beyond felt thinner than before, not physically, but in meaning, as if separation itself was beginning to dissolve under the weight of shared intent and unwavering presence. Caleb Morgan held steady at the edge of the narrow opening, his hands firm against the fractured structure as the fragile rhythm beyond continued to hold its presence, no longer uncertain, but now unmistakably consistent, like a quiet signal refusing to fade. The air inside the chamber felt suspended, heavy with meaning rather than heat, as if every particle of dust and light had been paused to witness what was unfolding between them and what lay beyond. Frost remained perfectly still beside him, his white coat muted by ash and fine debris, his posture unchanged but fully engaged, every instinct aligned with the same singular focus that now defined Caleb's actions. Caleb adjusted his position once more, carefully widening the opening just enough to improve access without compromising stability, each movement slow and deliberate, guided by precision rather than urgency. The sound beyond remained steady, not increasing, but becoming more structured, as if awareness itself was responding to their continued presence. Caleb leaned slightly closer, his voice calm and grounded as it passed into the confined space. "We are right here," he said softly, each word measured to carry reassurance without disruption. Frost responded with the slightest shift in stance, lowering his center of gravity, as if preparing for coordinated movement, his attention locked onto the same unseen point beyond the barrier. The structure around them groaned faintly in the distance, a reminder of instability beyond the chamber. But within this narrow focus, everything felt controlled, precise, and intentional. Caleb carefully stabilized another section of debris, ensuring the opening remained intact, his breathing steady as he worked. Dust drifted slowly through the faint light above, moving like suspended time, each particle emphasizing the stillness that surrounded them. Frost did not move forward, but his presence remained absolute, acting as both anchor and guide in a space where clarity had replaced uncertainty. Caleb exhaled slowly, feeling the weight of understanding settle fully into place, and then spoke again with quiet certainty. "We are not leaving you," he said, the words carrying through the confined space with calm assurance rather than command. The rhythmic sound beyond responded faintly, steady and present, as if acknowledging the connection that had formed across the barrier. Caleb paused for a brief moment, absorbing the significance of what Frost had led them to, and then shifted his position one final time to create a stable path forward. Frost remained beside him, unwavering, his focus unbroken, as the space between them and what lay beyond reached its thinnest point yet, where separation no longer felt like distance, but only the final threshold before contact.